tonight's topic. Jay will be into dialogue for the same theology on the cutting. He assists the director in the creation. With that, I will hand it.
So that it doesn't ruin my where my wife, Christine, in northern Indiana, calamity, interested in the relationship between faith and a widely told by the rancor and the abuse. But on August, and one named Father Bryce Shield, faith and science for his school open again. Call it Hurricane Dawkins. In October of 2000, we're riding high on Daniel Dennett would produce but Dennett's book. But anyway, and according to the data, the discoveries of modern science that the new atheists are peddling to you that it's because the new atheists do a science experiment. Explanation? Newton showed us a better to the way that we all see the world, who now sees to the new by what God watching Animal Planet or the day that we are bad if we're mammal breathe. And I hit in August of 2000 before I even knew there was an amazing thing to live that was close to me, including the interesting thing cover at that moment prepare the curriculum, a few nuggets, like maybe about faith and modern in the zip drive. My way through them, speech after all the second, that I hope it has to do with the difference, but rather the why. But as a rabbi, Jonathan Hines of perspectives, and teach as a theologian, all the while remaining, right? Catholics, be not overcoming my concern that perhaps, I went back, Genesis chapter 2. Genesis, one of them says exactly different them, it had to all line up per the details and truth that a cosmologist be in conflict. But then enrich and power into his science begins desire a scientific proof of God. And Canadian scientists have progressed and understand says you shouldn't thank God for structures even more harmonious, which was visible on its surface. Science controversy that was ninth grade biology student. Did I just think about evolution and the scientific theory? He didn't say that there are only a few. That becomes less mind-blowing diversity. God not only made the universe, us human beings. John Paul II says, yes, concern that there really be in modern science is an allusion to faith. And each became a theologian is because I realized that I had that's what John Paul II.
The villainy familiar to me, and there's certainly religion brings things bending judgment. This is nor is meaning really fine. As a friend, he was having tea with a sign is very fluid. The meaning religion. All right.
But it seems one side of it we say religion thinks he's the world. I tell myself and sends us through the wounds of Christ, right? Reality that science is account
of what it means to interpret like a textbook, postmodern, justifiably read in as many ways
that people can read those things. That what is our principle of interpretation? Situation was, and once again, that's
rational. Again, rational. When you have certain reality.
That I read the Bible as a stop asking me difficult questions. The hermeneutic that I just, and I can see that Lord, your servant is listening. Right? In this one, Sterium.
Intellectual life and faith can lie are in place. Reason side of the equation. More reasonably, let's say that a Freud or the author's mom or a person of reason.
The assumption. Okay, well, just they believe the they are not an encounter with the person, right? Is a relationship. I have to do that more often. Thank you.
Scriptural question and this sort of like God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament. How would you respond to someone who said, well, hey, kind of going along with what Jay asked, like someone who says, well, maybe I can't prove my assumptions for science, but at least it's consistent and I can trust that it's been consistent. Whereas for you, it seems like there's this God of the Old Testament, and you use the example of Samuel, who commands certain things that are really not good, and then this sort of God of the New Testament that calls you to sacrifice and death, that seems inconsistent, whereas at least science is consistent for me.
So I think I would focus on the science, the notion that science is consistent, which is patently absurd, actually. I mean, if you look at the history of not even intending to do something like Thomas Kuhn's Structures of Scientific Revolutions, but if you just look at the blank history, we're all Newtonians until we're not, right? And then all of a sudden we have relativity, we have quantum mechanics to deal with. Those two don't disagree with each other in the fine points. We still have no idea I think Chris brought up earlier today, like dark matter. No one knows what that is. You have an idea of what it does, And so if you look at the history of scientific development, it's incredible because it is incremental, but it's also recursive, right? And the idea that science is consistent, it can be consistent in certain ways. It can be consistent in terms of predicting certain outcomes. But if you look at, just the change that we've had in the space from when I was taking science classes as a high school and elementary school student, middle school student, and the model of the atom, the model of the atom we have now is completely different. You look at the implications of quantum mechanics for the practice of science, especially when we're just looking at formulating what science can actually tell us, and all of a sudden we're told, like, yeah, okay, gang, so we thought that things were either yes or no. Now the best we got is that things admit in probabilities, and upon observation, the wave function collapses into one of those two probabilities, or whatever probabilities there are. So I think the first thing I would do is push back and say, no, yeah, sure, the notion that science is uniformly consistent is just patently untrue. That being said, we are talking about two different kinds of data sets, right? You can say, well, look, with science, we get better at, we have better technology, we have better tools, we have cleaner theories, and in religion, we might not. And again, I would push back on that. Well, in fact, there is an idea that we have progress, that revelation is progressive. The magisterium has been developing and refining the essentials of our faith for 2,000 years, and we know better what it means to be, followers of Jesus Christ. We may not be as good at it as the apostles, and they were pretty lousy to begin with, most of them, or the church fathers. I mean, there's pockets or not pockets, but broad swaths of spiritual genius in our tradition. But in fact, we know a lot more about the biblical text than earlier Christians and scholars did. We know more about, the lived character of the church because we have 2,000 years of its history. Whereas the ecclesial or ecclesiastical speculations of a church father are impressive and beautiful, but they don't have the years on it, right? So I think I would just say, I think that consistency is, frankly, a modernist idol, because no one's got it, and we actually have the resources to celebrate that, and I don't think science does. Science is very good at displacing its own embarrassment, and maybe it shouldn't be.
Oh, and I would just add that the consistency of Old Testament and New Testament, I would suggest that a closer look, when you atomize certain passages, kind of like I did, you know what I mean, with the Samuel thing, you might come to the conclusion that the Old Testament is about, a harsh God who was unmerciful, but actually what I think is happening is, in the Old Testament, is the truth, the one truth of God, is breaking through slowly, right, layers of human ignorance and sin, right? I used to tell my students in fundamental theology, I'll say, if I could summarize it for you, I would put it this way. God has always revealed himself openly and fully to the world. And about 2,000 years ago, one woman got it and the word became flesh in her womb. You know what I mean? But Mary didn't come out of the blue. What she came out of was a long history in which God's people were slowly beginning to see the whole truth. And what I find consoling, paradoxically, about those things in the Old Testament we find unsettling is that I can look at my own life and see a similar pattern, where I'm glad I don't think the way I might have thought 20 years ago, right? I thank God for that change. But I also thank God that he was gracious and merciful enough to allow that change to be my own, and not just something he imposed on me.
I was wondering if you could, you mentioned there's no conflict between science and religion, and I think that actually goes beyond that in terms of if you could comment on the idea that in Judeo-Christian traditions that we have a God that transcends the created world seems to open up the space for science. So if we're not worshiping a tree, because God is beyond that, we can now study the tree. We can come up with a scientific method. We don't have to worry about offending some random deity by our kind of investigation of the world. And I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on that.
That's a fantastic point. We work very closely with a Ph.D. chemist and a theologian named Stacy Trasankos, who talks a lot about this in her work. In fact, I just saw her book in the podium, by the way, Particles of Faith. The idea that, you might want to ask the question, so there were many great breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs in many different cultures of the ancient world. The Chinese had it, the Babylonians had it, the Greeks. You can go through many, many different examples. But why do we talk about this particular period called the scientific revolution occurring in a Judeo-Christian culture, right? And from there becoming something that really transforms the whole world, right? Now there are people across the entire globe doing science. And I think that there's I don't think that you would have to say that Christianity in a sense caused science, right? But it certainly was a fertile soil for that approach, because it was one that, first of all, called into question the idea of the divinity of the world, right? The world is not divine, right? And also, because of its belief in divine freedom, this idea that we can't just simply, as I said, kind of alluded to in something before, we can't just sit back in our armchair and say, well, logically, therefore, this is the way the world has to be, and then just set it aside. We have to actually go in, because God is free, we actually have to go investigate the world and understand what he created. And that's what science does, right? So does that help? Is that a little bit, I don't know if I was getting exactly at the point, but okay. And Jay, I'm sure has more to add.
I have just a brief theological supplement. I think one thing that's interesting about the notions of immanence and transcendence, and what we have in Christianity are not philosophical notions. We have theological notions. And so unlike Aristotle, so Aristotle's God is completely transcendent. And so what does Aristotle's God do, which is what a perfect being does? Contemplate itself, contemplate God's self. That's it. Because if you're transcendent, you know, that's great. That's great news. You're not responsible. You couldn't possibly have any relation to anything immanent. Now, so I think for me the most helpful person that I've read on this is Hans Urs von Balthasar. Helsa, my wife, is a Balthasar scholar, but he says, what separates the philosophical and theological notions of transcendence and immanence in particular, a theology of transcendence doesn't end with transcendence. It actually ends with immanence. Transcendence is always immanentizing itself from this infinite fount. So God is always pouring God's self into the world as an act of grace. We're not, Neoplatonists who think that there's this weird pouring out or whatever. But God is always reaching out to us. God is always revealing God's self to us. And in the same way, when we approach the immanent world with that understanding, the immanent world we find is also transcending itself. So the theological notion basically puts us in this interesting kind of matrix, or this sort of flow between immanence and transcendence. God reaches out to the world points us to God. And Balthasar is solid on that. I don't know if any Balthasar fans? Yes, okay.
Yeah. Right on. There's a quote Ratzinger is fond of. He builds this whole book, Introduction to Christianity, around it. It comes from an anonymous Flemish Jesuit who wrote it as a kind of a eulogy for St. Ignatius of Loyola. Not to be encompassed by the greatest, but to allow oneself to be encompassed by the smallest. That is divine. And so when a scientist studies something small, he can encounter God, right? And when a scientist is brought to the edge of his knowledge and the edge of where our minds can even begin to conceive. I mean, science has come to conclusions that are natural paradoxes that we can't even think about. We can't think about light as a wave and a particle at one and the same time. But science tells us that it is, right? When we see those things, we encounter God both in this immanentizing, incarnational, being present in the smallest way, but at the same time also beyond it, through awe and wonder into the things that are far beyond our ability to conceive of them.
Thank you both for your comments so far. I guess my question is not in so much in defense of faith against science against faith, but in defense of. Let me rephrase that. So, if evolution is this theory is sustainable and tenable in science, where is the fall? Where's the fall come in? Was it this large group of 150,000 some odd, 150 million some odd humans, Homo sapiens, 200,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago, whatever it is, and God chose two to impart reason in, and the female sinned? Or is the entire story of the fall a metaphor? In which case, what theology of the fall do we have really as Christian people?
I think the church leads us to somewhere in between those two things. It would say that the story as we've traditionally received it has metaphorical elements to it, but also points to some real historical truth about humanity. And I think the best way to think about sin as a way of original sin and the fall is something that is completely amenable to how science may open up the idea that there were more than just two human beings at the beginning of the human race, for instance, right, which is one of the issues, one of the things at hand. And I kind of got to it when I was talking about reason. Jay and I were actually talking about this, but you all were talking about your thing, your questions. Jay and I were talking about this whole idea that somehow reason isn't reason unless I come to it all by myself, right? Everything in human life is relational. Somewhere along the way, relationality got damaged, right? Our relationship with God, our ability to receive ourselves from God, and also our relationship with one another, right? We curved in on ourselves, as Augustine would say, right? Rather than being like this, we went like this. However that may have happened, the fact that it happened in human life, and because God created us to be a family, it affected all of us, right? We don't stand on our own, and consequently, we need God to come into the world to heal that relational damage. We need to be, in a sense, reborn into a new family, which is exactly what baptism is, right? It's not just, it's this cleansing from sin, but it's also coming, where do you come out of water? You come out of water when you're being born, right? The water breaks and here comes the baby, right? Same thing with us. We come out of the baptismal font into a new way of existing and acting. We come into, literally, we come to exist inside Christ, whose sinlessness begins to then overcome our sinful mess. And how did it exactly happen? I don't think we need to know. I think we can let science tell us some of those details and work those things out. And I think that regardless of where it comes to, we're always going to come back to that fact. So I don't think that the dogma of original sin is in any danger of being lost, because 15 minutes after I leave here, I'll demonstrate it.
And I think just a minor... And this,
not that long. If you push me.
I think an important point that I think is woefully understressed for fair reasons is the fact that in the tradition of interpretation, there's a very wide range of interpretation of an account of the fall. I think one of the most provocative and interesting and unchallenged, or uncondemned rather, is Maximus the Confessor. When did human beings fall? The second they were created, the second they took on their meat suits, right? So, there's an understanding. There's an understanding of the church in the church that has we have a range of talking about this. It's already somewhat metaphorical, but they all point to the same reality. But we don't have an interpretive kind of regime that's imposed on us. We have to take original sin seriously, and the church has, in terms of how we understand that, actually gives a pretty wide berth to it. But the idea that I think this is, and largely kind of in a response to Protestant Reformation, we begin to kind of rigidify our biblical interpretation. And like, well, if you don't have the story where two dudes mess up and they get kicked out of a garden by, for fooling around with a snake and an apple, then how do you make account for it? And I think that when you look at the resources the tradition actually affords us to interpret this well, and with, a degree of, suppleness, that's already there. And the church gives us the luxury of actually kind of looking and seeing what we like. and taking it for a spin, you know. It's good to see you, by the way. How you been?
Not bad.
Good.
Forgive me, I went to a really liberal college. But so one of the arguments that I would always get is that an argument against organized Christianity is the harm that it's done historically, or alleged to have done historically. That God and tradition have been a consistent barrier to the discovery of truth in science, and that the ordering principles of Christianity have been, used in service of power to prolong suffering rather than alleviate it. So what do you say to someone who believes that, like, all organized power in religion is some form of oppression?
Sure. Could you gave 3 things, but they
One
were
question.
rather distinct. I want to speak to the first one. Could you
Sure.
repeat it?
Yeah. So the argument against organized Christianity is the harm that it's done in history.
It has done a great deal of harm in history. That is, anything good is that much worse when it falls, right? I mean, have you ever met a really evil frog? No. But have you ever met a really vicious dog? I mean, if you're in Louisiana where there are lots of dogs, then maybe so. I don't know about around here, but yeah, right? Dogs that have been bred to kill. And human beings can be the most sinister and diabolical of all. We would recognize that precisely in that scale, right, that which is capable of the greatest kind of good is also capable of the worst evil. I would say the same thing about organized religion. Last year, we had an event where we had an evolutionary psychologist come, and he speaks actually in my class every time I teach my faith science elective at Notre Dame. He's an evolutionary psychologist. He has a book called Supernatural Selection, How Religion Evolved. And he gives a talk for us called How Costly Rituals Made Us Human. And one of the things that I do after he talks about it is I begin to ask questions about organized religion, and it's amazing how my students' ideas about it change from bad to better, at least, from one to the other. Because the fact is that we need the opportunity to bind ourselves together in beliefs. That's what we do as human beings. We've done it from the beginning, right? Because it has been abused, does not disqualify proper and good use. And I would say that it's essential. And I think as young people who are Catholics, you shouldn't be afraid of telling people that. Because the fact is that we are alienated as hell in our society. People are sad and lonely, right? And they don't recognize the possibility that there can be any real communion, any lasting community, integral community. So I would go to that first. Secondly, about the science question. That is propaganda from the late 19th century. I gave a talk about that on actually Tuesday night of last week, precisely about this very issue, a week ago tonight, about the conflict thesis and where it comes from. And I'd be happy to share that with any of you all. I write about it in the second edition of my textbook if you're interested in buying a textbook. But anyway, I'm sure you were hoping that opportunity would arise sooner or later. But there are real reasons why Galileo happened. There was a real abuse of power in that situation, but that was the exception, not the rule. So, I mean, I can only assert that now and not argue it. But I'm going to give the microphone to Jay because I've gone on too long.
Thank you.
So, your third point, I think the one about, could you just restate that just for the record, let the record show?
What do you say to someone who believes that that power and organized power is a singular source of oppression, regardless of good intention?
Think. Okay, great. So you went to a liberal college. That's
I loved it.
I would too. No, I think, and this is, so my field of research is kind of all the theory stuff, and one of the things I think is really interesting is the way in which, and frankly, the best people to read on this are Marxist ideology critics, of saying, so at what point does a critique of power become actually a sort of regime of power? So basically, you can see this in sort of, and this pains me to say it, but forms of sort of Soviet Marxism, sort of Marxist-Leninism. The idea is that we reject all ideology. Religion is an ideology, capitalism is an ideology, and so forth. But at some point, it becomes a regime of power itself that is subject to its own critiques. If you're a reader of Foucault, I think Foucault was amazing. Now he's not going to be for everybody, and he's not going to be. As a Christian, you can't sign off on all the things that he says. But I think one of the most powerful criticisms of his critique of power is from Jean Baudrillard, who says, "Well, look, the problem with your theory is that it's too good. It explains what it's supposed to explain, and therefore it has to, by your own definition, be subject to its own critique." So I think there needs to be, there's a realism about power. And in fact, once we get toward an idealism of power, we lose the ability to actually make the critique. So when we talk about, well, look, the church is a source of authority and power, and it's done lousy things, therefore, we move from the particular to the universal, or to the larger collective. The problem with that is that you have villains in the story who actually get off scot-free when we make that transition. So like Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times reporter, who I don't like typically, but he was talking about this was a few years ago when the sex abuse crisis in the church was going strong, and he wrote this very self-serving piece. He's like, look, gang, I know it's easy to beat up on the Catholic Church, but I know a lot of really good grassroots priests out there. The real problem is the bishops who are shuffling the priest around and all this sort of stuff. Now, so he's saying like the problem is structural. And I say, that's a huge problem, but it's particular bishops who did things like that. And it's also particular priests who did the abusing. And we need to go after those particular people who violated the rules and sort of ethics of power. Power is a real thing. People have it. And it's usually the people who have it, who have it and use it the most wantonly are the ones who deny that they have it or that it exists or that it should be used at all. So I think I just want to push back on the way that the question is often framed in sort of a postmodern context, which is to say there's a thing called power and it does bad things, therefore no one should have it. While the people who are still going to do it, they don't care what postmodern critics are going to say. They still get to use power. And instead, I think we should have a sort of Inglourious Bastards approach. Let's go after them all, every single one of them, in Christian charity.
I saw that movie, but I don't remember the In Christian Charity. But let's hear it for him.